Question 1. Upon reviewing a complaint filed by a passenger with a mobility impairment in Alabama, who alleges that a public transit bus driver refused to allow them to board with their service animal due to a perceived inconvenience, what is the most appropriate professional response for the transit authority to undertake? Option A. Issue a formal apology to the passenger and immediately retrain all drivers on service animal policies without further investigation into the specific circumstances of the alleged refusal. Option B. Offer the passenger a voucher for future rides as compensation without investigating the driver's actions or the transit authority's adherence to ADA guidelines. Option C. Dismiss the complaint, stating that drivers have the final authority on boarding decisions to maintain operational efficiency, and that service animals are not always accommodated if they cause delays. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the incident, including interviewing the driver and passenger, examining the transit authority's policies on service animals and ADA compliance, and determining if a reasonable accommodation was denied based on Alabama's interpretation of federal disability law. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the incident, including interviewing the driver and passenger, examining the transit authority's policies on service animals and ADA compliance, and determining if a reasonable accommodation was denied based on Alabama's interpretation of federal disability law. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of an individual with a disability against the operational realities and legal obligations of a transportation provider in Alabama. The core issue is ensuring compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA) and relevant Alabama case law while providing efficient service. Careful judgment is required to avoid discrimination and ensure reasonable accommodations are made. The best professional approach involves a thorough, individualized assessment of the passenger's needs in consultation with the passenger, and then implementing the most appropriate and least restrictive accommodation that is safe and feasible. This aligns with the spirit and letter of the ADA, which mandates reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. Alabama case law, such as interpretations of the ADA in state courts, often emphasizes the need for transportation providers to engage in an interactive process with passengers to determine effective accommodations. This approach prioritizes the passenger's dignity and autonomy while ensuring the provider meets its legal obligations. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on a blanket policy that prohibits any deviation from standard boarding procedures, regardless of the individual's specific needs or the feasibility of an accommodation. This fails to acknowledge the individualized nature of disability accommodations and can lead to discriminatory practices, violating the ADA requirement for reasonable modifications. Another incorrect approach would be to offer an accommodation that is demonstrably unsafe or unduly burdensome for the transportation provider, without first exploring less restrictive alternatives. Accommodations are required. They do not necessitate actions that compromise safety or impose excessive costs or operational disruptions. The ADA allows for exceptions when an accommodation would fundamentally alter the nature of the service or pose a direct threat. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to dismiss the passenger's request without a good faith effort to understand their needs or explore potential solutions. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and can be interpreted as a failure to engage in the required interactive process, leading to potential legal repercussions and ethical breaches. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and information gathering from the passenger. This should be followed by an assessment of the available resources and operational constraints. The next step is to identify potential accommodations that are both effective for the passenger and feasible for the provider, prioritizing those that are least restrictive. Finally, the chosen accommodation should be implemented and documented with a clear understanding of its rationale. Question 2. When evaluating an employee's claim for disability benefits under the Alabama Workers' Compensation Act, a claims adjuster receives conflicting medical reports regarding an employee's back injury sustained in a workplace accident. One report suggests the employee will likely recover within 6 months with physical therapy, while another indicates the injury may result in chronic pain and a permanent reduction in lifting capacity. What is the most appropriate course of action for the claims adjuster to take to ensure compliance with Alabama disability rights law? Option A. Obtain a comprehensive independent medical examination (IME) to definitively assess the prognosis and long-term impact of the injury, and consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama workers' compensation law to interpret the findings in light of the Act's definitions of temporary and permanent disability. Option B. Immediately classify the disability as temporary based on the report suggesting a 6-month recovery, as this is the more optimistic prognosis. Option C. Classify the disability as permanent based on the report indicating chronic pain and reduced lifting capacity, to err on the side of caution for the employee. Option D. Deny benefits until the employee provides a single, unequivocal medical opinion that clearly states whether the disability is temporary or permanent. The correct answer is A. Obtain a comprehensive independent medical examination, IME, to definitively assess the prognosis and long-term impact of the injury, and consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama workers' compensation law to interpret the findings in light of the Act's definitions of temporary and permanent disability. Explanation. When evaluating an employee's claim for disability benefits under Alabama law, distinguishing between temporary and permanent disabilities is crucial for proper benefit administration and adherence to the Alabama Workers' Compensation Act. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of medical evidence, legal definitions, and the potential for an employee's condition to evolve. Misclassifying a disability can lead to significant financial and legal repercussions for both the employer and the employee, potentially denying rightful benefits or imposing undue burdens. The correct approach involves a thorough review of all available medical documentation, expert opinions, and the specific nature and duration of the employee's impairment. This includes considering whether the condition is expected to resolve within a reasonable period, allowing the employee to return to their previous work or a modified capacity, or if it is a long-term or irreversible condition that will permanently affect their ability to earn a livelihood. Alabama law differentiates benefits based on this classification, with temporary total disability benefits typically covering the period of recovery, and permanent disability benefits addressing long-term or total loss of earning capacity. A careful, evidence-based assessment, often involving consultation with medical professionals and legal counsel specializing in Alabama workers' compensation, ensures compliance with the Act's provisions for each disability type. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the employee's subjective report of pain or limitations without objective medical evidence to support the claim of permanence. This fails to adhere to the evidentiary standards required by Alabama law for establishing permanent disability. Another incorrect approach is to prematurely classify a condition as permanent based on initial symptoms, without allowing for a sufficient recovery period or obtaining a definitive prognosis from treating physicians or independent medical examiners. This can lead to an improper award of permanent benefits when the condition might have been temporary. Furthermore, assuming a disability is temporary simply because the employee expresses a desire to return to work, without a clear medical prognosis indicating such a return is feasible, is also an improper assessment. This overlooks the legal definition of temporary disability and the need for objective medical findings. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes objective medical evidence, adhere strictly to the definitions and requirements of the Alabama Workers' Compensation Act, and seeks expert medical and legal guidance when the nature or duration of a disability is unclear. This involves a systematic evaluation of the medical condition, its impact on the employee's ability to perform their job duties, and the expected trajectory of recovery or long-term impairment. Question 3. A disability advocate in Alabama is representing a client who has experienced discrimination in accessing public services. While Alabama law and federal statutes provide some protections, the advocate believes these protections are insufficient to fully address the systemic issues and the client's broader human rights concerns, which are more comprehensively articulated in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCUP. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advocate to take? Option A. Advise the client that their rights are limited by the scope of current Alabama law and that international conventions cannot provide additional recourse. Option B. File a legal challenge solely based on the UNCUP, arguing that it creates direct, enforceable rights within Alabama that supersede existing state and federal statutes. Option C. Pursue all available legal remedies under Alabama and federal law for the client's immediate discrimination claim, while also using the principles of the UNCUP to inform advocacy for systemic policy reform and to interpret existing domestic laws. Option D. Focus exclusively on advocating for legislative amendments to Alabama law to fully align with the UNCUP, deferring any action on the client's specific discrimination claim until such changes are enacted. The correct answer is C. Pursue all available legal remedies under Alabama and federal law for the client's immediate discrimination claim, while also using the principles of the UNCUP to inform advocacy for systemic policy reform and to interpret existing domestic laws. Explanation. The analysis reveals a complex ethical dilemma faced by a disability advocate in Alabama, requiring careful navigation between domestic legal obligations and international human rights principles. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate needs and rights of an individual client with the broader advocacy goals informed by international standards, particularly when domestic legal avenues may be perceived as insufficient or slow. The advocate must consider how to best uphold the client's dignity and autonomy while leveraging all available legal and advocacy tools. The most ethically sound and professionally responsible approach involves prioritizing the client's immediate well-being and legal rights within the existing Alabama legal framework, while simultaneously advocating for systemic change informed by international standards. This approach recognizes that, while the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities UNCUP provides a crucial aspirational framework and interpretive lens, it does not directly create enforceable rights within Alabama law in the same way as state statutes or federal laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. Therefore, the advocate's primary duty is to exhaust all legal remedies available under Alabama law and federal law, such as filing complaints with relevant state agencies or pursuing litigation. Concurrently, the advocate can and should use the principles of the UNCUP to inform their arguments, frame their advocacy for policy reform, and educate stakeholders about best practices and the broader human rights context. This dual strategy ensures the client receives immediate legal recourse while contributing to long-term systemic improvements aligned with international human rights norms. An approach that solely relies on the UNCUP as the primary legal basis for immediate action in Alabama would be professionally deficient. The UNCUP reflects widely accepted human rights principles. It is not self-executing in the United States legal system. Therefore, attempting to litigate or enforce rights solely based on the convention without grounding them in existing domestic statutes or case law would likely be unsuccessful and fail to provide the client with the immediate legal protections they are entitled to under Alabama and federal law. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns because Alabama law does not explicitly mirror every provision of the UNCUP. This would represent a failure to uphold the advocate's ethical duty to serve their client diligently and to advocate for their rights to the fullest extent possible. It also ignores the interpretive value of international instruments in shaping domestic legal understanding and policy. Finally, an approach that focuses exclusively on advocating for legislative changes to align Alabama law with the UNCUP without addressing the client's immediate legal needs would also be ethically problematic. While systemic advocacy is important, the advocate's primary responsibility is to the individual client before them, ensuring their rights are protected and redressed within the current legal landscape. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a thorough assessment of the client's immediate legal needs and available remedies under Alabama and federal law. This should be followed by an analysis of how international frameworks like the UNCUP can inform and strengthen advocacy efforts, both for the individual client and for broader systemic change. A commitment to both direct client representation and systemic advocacy, grounded in a clear understanding of the applicable legal hierarchy, is essential. Question 4. Comparative studies suggest that healthcare providers in Alabama may face ethical dilemmas when assessing individuals who report significant functional limitations but lack a clear, universally recognized medical diagnosis. A patient presents to a clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, stating they experience severe fatigue, cognitive fog, and chronic pain that significantly impacts their ability to work and engage in social activities. They have seen multiple specialists, but no single diagnosis has been definitively established that fully explains their constellation of symptoms, though some suggest a possible autoimmune condition or chronic fatigue syndrome. The provider must determine if this patient meets the definition of disability under Alabama law to recommend appropriate accommodations. Which of the following approaches best navigates this situation ethically and legally? Option A. Conduct a thorough assessment that considers the patient's reported functional limitations, their impact on major life activities, and any available medical evidence, even if a definitive single diagnosis is absent, to determine if the criteria for disability under the Alabama Disabilities Act are met. Option B. Rely solely on the presence of a formal, specific medical diagnosis from a recognized specialist to determine disability status, as this provides objective proof of a condition. Option C. Dismiss the patient's claims of functional limitations if their condition is not readily apparent or does not align with common understandings of disability, as it may be difficult to substantiate. Option D. Prioritize administrative ease by classifying the patient as not disabled unless a clear, easily documented condition is present, to avoid complex accommodation processes. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough assessment that considers the patient's reported functional limitations, their impact on major life activities, and any available medical evidence, even if a definitive single diagnosis is absent, to determine if the criteria for disability under the Alabama Disabilities Act are met. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing an individual's right to privacy and dignity with the need to accurately assess their eligibility for disability accommodations under Alabama law. The healthcare provider is in a position of trust and must act ethically and in accordance with the Alabama Disabilities Act (ADA) and related state statutes. Misinterpreting or misapplying the definition of disability can lead to significant harm to the individual, including denial of necessary support and potential legal repercussions for the provider or institution. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the assessment is thorough, objective, and respects the individual's autonomy. The best approach involves a comprehensive evaluation that considers the individual's own description of their condition and its impact, alongside objective medical evidence. This aligns with the broad definition of disability under the Alabama Disabilities Act, which often encompasses conditions that substantially limit one or more major life activities, even if not explicitly listed in a diagnostic manual. The individual's subjective experience of their limitations is a crucial component of establishing a disability, as it directly addresses the substantial limitation aspect. This approach respects the individual's perspective and ensures that the assessment is holistic, as mandated by principles of disability rights law that aim to prevent discrimination based on a wide range of impairments. An approach that solely relies on a formal diagnosis from a specific medical specialty, without considering the individual's reported functional limitations, is flawed. This fails to acknowledge that many conditions, particularly chronic or less visible ones, may not fit neatly into a single diagnostic category, but still substantially limit major life activities. Ethically, it can be dismissive of the individual's lived experience. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the individual's concerns because their condition is not immediately apparent or does not fit a common understanding of disability. This ignores the legal standard of substantial limitation, which is not tied to visibility, but to functional impact. It also violates the ethical principle of treating all individuals with respect and dignity, regardless of the nature of their condition. Finally, an approach that prioritizes administrative convenience or the ease of classification over a thorough assessment of the individual's actual limitations is ethically and legally unacceptable. It prioritizes institutional efficiency over the individual's rights and well-being, which is contrary to the spirit and letter of disability rights legislation in Alabama. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the relevant legal definitions of disability under Alabama law. This involves actively listening to the individual's account of their condition and its impact on their daily life. The next step is to gather objective information, including medical records and, if necessary, seeking further evaluation. Crucially, the assessment must focus on the functional limitations experienced by the individual and whether these limitations substantially impact one or more major life activities, as defined by the Alabama Disabilities Act. This process requires empathy, thoroughness, and a commitment to upholding the individual's rights. Question 5. The investigation demonstrates that a landlord in Birmingham, Alabama, has expressed significant reservations about renting a property to a prospective tenant who receives disability benefits, citing concerns about the reliability of their income. The landlord has indicated a preference for tenants with traditional employment. What is the most appropriate course of action for a housing professional advising the landlord? Option A. Advise the landlord to reject the applicant outright due to concerns about the perceived instability of disability income, as this is a common landlord concern. Option B. Advise the landlord to conduct a thorough review of the applicant's financial documentation, including proof of disability benefits and any supporting documentation for their income stability, and then consult relevant Alabama and federal fair housing laws to determine if the applicant's rights are being infringed upon, exploring potential reasonable accommodations if necessary. Option C. Advise the landlord to inform the applicant that their income source is not acceptable and suggest they seek housing elsewhere. Option D. Advise the landlord to find a non-discriminatory reason to deny the applicant, such as citing minor cosmetic issues with the property that would be too costly to address for this specific applicant. The correct answer is B. Advise the landlord to conduct a thorough review of the applicant's financial documentation, including proof of disability benefits and any supporting documentation for their income stability, and then consult relevant Alabama and federal fair housing laws to determine if the applicant's rights are being infringed upon, exploring potential reasonable accommodations if necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's expressed wishes and the potential for discrimination based on disability. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of Alabama's disability rights laws, particularly the Alabama Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which prohibit discrimination in housing based on disability. The professional must balance the client's autonomy with the legal and ethical obligation to ensure fair housing practices. The best approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the situation, focusing on the legal framework governing disability rights in Alabama. This means understanding that a landlord's refusal to rent based on a perceived inability to pay, which is directly linked to a disability, and its associated support systems, could constitute illegal discrimination. The professional should first gather all relevant facts, including the applicant's financial information and any documentation related to their disability and support. Then, they should consult the relevant Alabama and federal statutes and case law to determine if the landlord's actions violate anti-discrimination provisions. If a violation appears likely, the professional should advise the landlord of their legal obligations and explore reasonable accommodations or modifications that could address the landlord's concerns without resorting to discriminatory practices. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct by seeking a resolution that upholds the applicant's rights while informing the landlord of their responsibilities. An incorrect approach would be to immediately refuse to assist the applicant based on the landlord's stated concerns. This fails to acknowledge the potential for discrimination and bypasses the legal protections afforded to individuals with disabilities. It assumes the landlord's assessment is accurate and legally permissible, which is a dangerous assumption in the context of disability rights. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the landlord to simply reject the applicant without further investigation or consideration of accommodations. This directly contravenes the principles of fair housing and could expose the landlord to legal liability. It ignores the legal requirement to engage in an interactive process to explore reasonable accommodations. Finally, advising the landlord to find a pretextual reason to deny the applicant, unrelated to their disability, is also an ethically and legally unsound approach. This constitutes a deceptive practice and does not resolve the underlying issue of potential discrimination. It attempts to circumvent the law rather than comply with it. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the core legal and ethical obligations. This involves understanding the specific protections offered by Alabama disability rights law. Next, they should gather all pertinent facts objectively. Then, they must analyze these facts against the relevant legal standards. If a potential violation is identified, the professional should explore all legally permissible and ethically sound solutions, prioritizing compliance and the protection of individual rights. Question 6. Analysis of a situation in Alabama where a client, deeply involved in early disability rights activism, expresses frustration that current services do not fully reflect the spirit of the advocacy they participated in decades ago. The client feels that, while legal protections exist, the practical implementation and accessibility of services have not kept pace with the foundational principles they fought for. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach for a service provider in Alabama to take in response to this client's concerns? Option A. Acknowledge the client's historical perspective and valuable contributions to disability rights, then clearly explain the current legal framework and available services in Alabama, focusing on how to best utilize these to address their present needs and rights. Option B. Advise the client that their advocacy has secured sufficient rights and that current services are merely administrative functions that cannot be improved upon. Option C. Gently inform the client that their historical perspective is valuable for understanding the evolution of rights, but is not directly applicable to current service provision requirements in Alabama. Option D. Focus the conversation entirely on the historical advocacy efforts, validating their past work without delving into the specifics of current Alabama disability rights law or available services. The correct answer is A. Acknowledge the client's historical perspective and valuable contributions to disability rights, then clearly explain the current legal framework and available services in Alabama, focusing on how to best utilize these to address their present needs and rights. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the historical context of disability rights advocacy with the current legal and ethical obligations of a service provider in Alabama. The challenge lies in recognizing that, while past advocacy efforts were crucial, current practice must strictly adhere to established Alabama disability rights law and ethical guidelines for service provision. Careful judgment is required to ensure that actions are both informed by history and compliant with present-day legal standards. The best professional approach involves directly addressing the client's expressed needs and concerns through established legal channels and service provisions within Alabama's disability rights framework. This means acknowledging the client's historical perspective while firmly grounding the response in current legal requirements and available resources. This approach is correct because it prioritizes the client's immediate well-being and legal rights as defined by Alabama law, such as those potentially stemming from the Americans with Disabilities Act as interpreted and applied within Alabama, and any specific state statutes or regulations governing disability services. It ensures that the client receives appropriate support and advocacy based on current legal entitlements and established service delivery models, rather than relying on outdated or generalized advocacy strategies. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns because they are framed within a historical context, suggesting that past advocacy is irrelevant to current needs. This fails to acknowledge the client's lived experience and the ongoing relevance of the principles fought for by historical advocates. Ethically, it is dismissive and unhelpful. Legally, it risks overlooking current legal obligations that may have evolved from those historical struggles. Another incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the historical advocacy efforts without translating them into concrete actions or service provisions that align with current Alabama disability rights law. While understanding history is valuable, it does not substitute for providing current, legally compliant support. This approach risks offering theoretical discussions instead of practical assistance, potentially leaving the client without the tangible resources or legal protections they are entitled to under Alabama law. A further incorrect approach involves suggesting that the client's historical advocacy efforts are sufficient and that no further action or service provision is necessary. This is fundamentally flawed as it ignores the ongoing need for support and the potential for new or evolving challenges that require current legal and service interventions. It also fails to recognize that legal rights and service provisions are dynamic and require continuous engagement to ensure they are effectively utilized. Professionals should approach such situations by first actively listening to and validating the client's concerns, acknowledging the historical context they bring. Second, they must assess the client's current needs and rights through the lens of applicable Alabama disability rights law and regulations. Third, they should clearly communicate the available resources, legal options, and service pathways within the current legal framework. Finally, professionals must advocate for the client within these established parameters, ensuring that their actions are both ethically sound and legally compliant with Alabama's specific disability rights landscape. Question 7. Consider a scenario in Alabama where a long-term resident of a state-run care facility who has a mobility impairment expresses a strong desire to participate in a community event that requires navigating uneven terrain. The facility staff are hesitant, citing potential risks and the inconvenience of providing specialized assistance. Drawing upon the historical context of disability rights in Alabama, what is the most ethically and legally sound approach for a disability advocate to take in supporting this resident? Option A. Advise the resident that, while their desire is understandable, the facility's concerns about safety and logistics are paramount and participation may not be feasible without significant disruption. Option B. Suggest that the resident attend a similar, more accessible event within the facility grounds, framing it as a compromise that addresses their desire for social engagement without the associated risks. Option C. Focus solely on the resident's immediate comfort and safety, prioritizing the facility's existing protocols and discouraging participation if it deviates significantly from established routines. Option D. Advocate for the resident's participation by researching and citing relevant Alabama disability rights laws that mandate reasonable accommodations and support for community integration, emphasizing the historical struggle against segregation and exclusion of individuals with disabilities. Correct answer is D. Advocate for the resident's participation by researching and citing relevant Alabama disability rights laws that mandate reasonable accommodations and support for community integration, emphasizing the historical struggle against segregation and exclusion of individuals with disabilities. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of an individual with the broader historical context of disability, rights advocacy, and legal protections in Alabama. The challenge lies in recognizing that while immediate comfort and access are important, they must be pursued in a manner that upholds the principles and legal frameworks established to prevent the very discrimination that historically marginalized individuals with disabilities. Careful judgment is required to ensure that actions taken do not inadvertently reinforce outdated, paternalistic attitudes or overlook established legal rights. The best professional approach involves advocating for the individual's immediate needs while grounding the request in the established legal rights and principles of disability inclusion as recognized by Alabama law. This means understanding that the individual's request for a specific accommodation is not merely a personal preference but a right protected under disability rights legislation. By framing the request within this legal context, the professional demonstrates an understanding of the historical struggle for disability rights and the legal mechanisms put in place to ensure equal access and prevent discrimination. This approach respects the individual's autonomy and dignity, aligning with the ethical imperative to advocate for vulnerable populations and uphold legal mandates. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the request as a matter of personal preference or to attempt to fulfill it without acknowledging the underlying legal rights. This fails to recognize the historical context of disability rights, which fought against such dismissals and paternalistic decision-making. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the convenience of the institution over the individual's legally protected rights. This echoes the historical discrimination that disability rights laws were designed to combat, where the needs and rights of individuals with disabilities were often subordinated to the perceived needs or preferences of the majority. Failing to cite or consider relevant Alabama disability rights statutes or principles when advocating for the individual also represents a significant ethical and professional failing, as it neglects the very legal framework designed to protect the individual. Professionals should approach such situations by first actively listening to and understanding the individual's needs and preferences. Then they must consult relevant Alabama disability rights laws and guidelines to identify the legal basis for the requested accommodation. The next step is to articulate the request clearly, framing it as a matter of legal right and necessity, rather than a mere request. This involves educating stakeholders about the legal obligations and the historical significance of ensuring equal access and preventing discrimination. Finally, professionals should be prepared to advocate persistently and ethically for the individual's rights, ensuring that decisions are made in compliance with the law and with respect for the individual's dignity and autonomy. Question 8. During the evaluation of a new client's case concerning alleged discrimination under Alabama disability rights law, The client expresses a strong desire to pursue a specific legal strategy based on their interpretation of a recent, highly publicized court ruling. However, your preliminary assessment suggests that the ruling, while significant, may not directly support the client's intended approach due to subtle factual distinctions and the broader implications of other established Alabama case law. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Thoroughly research and explain to the client the specific landmark court cases in Alabama disability rights law that are most relevant to their situation, detailing how these precedents have shaped legal protections and how they might apply to their unique facts, thereby enabling the client to make a fully informed decision. Option B. Advise the client to abandon their desired strategy immediately, as your initial assessment indicates it is unlikely to succeed based on your understanding of the publicized court ruling. Option C. Recommend that the client pursue a claim based on a different, less prominent case, without fully exploring the applicability of the publicized ruling to their specific circumstances. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested strategy without further detailed explanation of the relevant case law, assuming the client's understanding of the ruling is sufficient. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly research and explain to the client the specific landmark court cases in Alabama disability rights law that are most relevant to their situation, detailing how these precedents have shaped legal protections and how they might apply to their unique facts, thereby enabling the client to make a fully informed decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to be based on a misunderstanding of their rights or the legal landscape. Navigating this requires a delicate balance of respecting client autonomy while fulfilling the professional duty to provide competent and ethical representation, particularly in the context of disability rights, where historical inequities and evolving legal interpretations are significant. The professional must exercise careful judgment to ensure the client's best interests are served within the bounds of Alabama law and ethical practice. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves thoroughly educating the client about the relevant landmark court cases in Alabama disability rights law that directly address their situation. This includes explaining how these cases have shaped the legal protections available, the precedents they set, and how those precedents might apply to their specific circumstances. This approach is correct because it empowers the client with knowledge, enabling them to make informed decisions about their legal strategy. It aligns with the ethical duty of competence and diligence, ensuring the client understands the potential outcomes and limitations of their case based on established legal principles. This proactive educational step is crucial for building trust and ensuring the client's consent to any proposed course of action is truly informed. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the client's request based on a superficial understanding or personal judgment of its likelihood of success. This fails to uphold the duty of diligence and competence, as it bypasses the necessary research and client education required to assess the claim properly. It also risks alienating the client and failing to explore all potential avenues for relief, potentially violating ethical obligations to represent the client zealously within the bounds of the law. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's request without fully explaining the relevant legal precedents and their implications. This is ethically problematic as it does not ensure the client's consent is informed. The client may be acting on incomplete or inaccurate information about their rights and the potential outcomes, leading to unrealistic expectations and potential dissatisfaction. This approach neglects the professional's responsibility to provide clear and comprehensive legal advice. A further incorrect approach is to advise the client to abandon their claim solely because a particular landmark case did not result in a favorable outcome for a different party. This is a misapplication of legal reasoning. Landmark cases establish principles that can be applied broadly, and the specific facts of the client's situation, when analyzed in light of these principles, might still lead to a successful outcome. This approach demonstrates a lack of thorough legal analysis and a failure to explore the nuances of how legal precedent applies. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must actively listen to and understand the client's objectives and concerns. Second, they must conduct thorough legal research, focusing on relevant statutes, regulations, and, crucially, landmark court cases within the specified jurisdiction, Alabama disability rights law. Third, they must analyze how these legal precedents apply to the client's unique factual circumstances. Fourth, they must clearly and comprehensively communicate their findings to the client, explaining the legal landscape, potential strategies, risks, and benefits in an understandable manner. Finally, they must collaborate with the client to develop a strategy that is both legally sound and aligned with the client's informed decisions, always prioritizing ethical obligations and the client's best interests. Question 9. Research into the Alabama Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act reveals that disabilities can manifest in diverse ways. An individual approaches a service provider in Alabama, expressing difficulty in completing a standard application form due to what they describe as processing challenges. The service provider observes no outward physical or sensory impairment. What is the most appropriate course of action for the service provider to take? Option A. Assume the individual is exaggerating their difficulties and proceed with the standard application process without further inquiry. Option B. Engage in a conversation with the individual to understand the nature of their processing challenges and explore potential reasonable accommodations for the application process. Option C. Immediately suggest the individual seek a medical diagnosis before any assistance can be considered, without attempting to understand their current challenges. Option D. Politely inform the individual that since there are no visible signs of a disability, no special assistance can be provided for the application. The correct answer is B. Engage in a conversation with the individual to understand the nature of their processing challenges and explore potential reasonable accommodations for the application process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the complexities of identifying and accommodating different types of disabilities under Alabama law, specifically the Alabama Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, APCA. The challenge lies in recognizing that a disability is not always immediately apparent and can manifest in various forms, each requiring a tailored understanding and response. Careful judgment is required to ensure that an individual's rights are protected and that appropriate accommodations are considered without making assumptions or discriminatory judgments. The best professional approach involves a proactive and informed engagement with the individual to understand their specific needs. This means initiating a dialogue to explore the nature of the disability and any potential barriers they are experiencing. This approach is correct because it aligns with the spirit and letter of the APCA, which mandates reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. By seeking to understand the individual's situation directly, the professional demonstrates respect for their autonomy and gathers the necessary information to make informed decisions about potential accommodations. This directly supports the APCA goal of preventing discrimination and ensuring equal opportunities for persons with disabilities. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the individual's concerns based on a superficial assessment of their outward presentation. This is ethically and legally flawed because it fails to acknowledge the existence of non-visible disabilities, such as mental or developmental disabilities, which are protected under the APCA. Alabama law does not require a disability to be physically apparent to warrant protection or consideration for accommodation. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a lack of immediate understanding of the disability equates to a lack of a valid need for accommodation. This demonstrates a failure to engage in the interactive process required to identify and implement reasonable accommodations. The APCA expects professionals to work with individuals to find solutions, not to disengage when the nature of the disability is not immediately obvious. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to offer a generic accommodation without understanding the specific challenges the individual faces. While well-intentioned, this can be ineffective and may not address the actual barriers presented by the disability. The APCA emphasizes the need for reasonable accommodations, which implies a tailored response based on the individual's unique circumstances. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Active listening and open communication to understand the individual's stated needs and concerns. 2. A commitment to learning about the various types of disabilities recognized under Alabama law, including those that are not physically apparent. 3. engaging in an interactive process to explore potential barriers and identify appropriate, individualized accommodations. 4. Consulting relevant legal guidance and resources when necessary to ensure compliance with the EPCA. Question 10. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of a complaint arising from the miscalculation of reasonable accommodation costs under Alabama disability rights law. A company in Birmingham, Alabama, is considering a new assistive technology for an employee with a disability, estimated to cost $15,000 annually. The company's annual payroll is $5,000,000. The company is aware of a federal tax credit that can offset 50% of the cost of such technology, up to a maximum credit of $5,000 per year. Additionally, a state grant program in Alabama offers reimbursement for 25% of the cost of approved assistive technology, with a maximum annual reimbursement of $3,000. What is the net annual cost of the assistive technology to the company, and what is the most legally defensible approach to determining its reasonableness? Option A. The net annual cost is $10,000. The most legally defensible approach is to consider the initial cost of $15,000 as the primary factor in determining undue hardship, as the tax credit and grant are not guaranteed. Option B. The net annual cost is $7,500. The most legally defensible approach is to calculate the net cost by subtracting 50% of the initial cost, federal tax credit, and 25% of the initial cost, state grant, from the initial cost, and then comparing this net cost to the company's overall financial resources to assess undue hardship. Option C. The net annual cost is $6,000. The most legally defensible approach is to calculate the net cost by subtracting the maximum available federal tax credit and the maximum available state grant reimbursement from the initial cost, and then comparing this net cost to the company's overall financial resources to assess undue hardship. Option D. The net annual cost is $11,250. The most legally defensible approach is to subtract the full potential federal tax credit, $7,500, and the full potential state grant, $3,000, from the initial cost, as these are direct financial benefits. The correct answer is C. The net annual cost is $6,000. The most legally defensible approach is to calculate the net cost by subtracting the maximum available federal tax credit and the maximum available state grant reimbursement from the initial cost, and then comparing this net cost to the company's overall financial resources to assess undue hardship. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of a complaint arising from the miscalculation of reasonable accommodation costs, with a high potential impact on the individual's employment and the organization's reputation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise understanding of Alabama's specific legal framework for disability rights, particularly concerning the financial aspects of reasonable accommodations, and the ability to translate that understanding into accurate financial projections. The pressure to minimize costs must be balanced against the legal obligation to provide effective accommodations. The best approach involves a detailed, documented calculation of the direct costs associated with the proposed accommodation, factoring in any potential tax credits or external funding sources available under Alabama law or federal programs applicable in Alabama. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the employer's obligation to provide reasonable accommodations without imposing undue hardship. Alabama law, like federal law under the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA), requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so would cause undue hardship. Undue hardship is typically defined in terms of significant difficulty or expense. By meticulously calculating the net cost, including any available financial assistance, the employer can demonstrate that the accommodation is not unduly burdensome and that the proposed solution is financially feasible and legally compliant. This detailed financial analysis provides a robust defense against potential claims of discrimination. An incorrect approach involves simply estimating the cost based on a general understanding of similar accommodations, without performing a specific, documented calculation for the individual situation. This is professionally unacceptable because it fails to meet the standard of due diligence required by Alabama disability rights law. Vague estimate does not provide a basis for determining undue hardship and could lead to an underestimation or overestimation of costs, potentially resulting in an inadequate accommodation or an unnecessary refusal. Another incorrect approach is to immediately assume the accommodation is too expensive based on an initial, unsubstantiated quote from a vendor. This is professionally unacceptable, as it bypasses the critical step of exploring all available cost-saving measures, such as bulk purchasing, alternative vendors, or potential subsidies. Alabama law expects employers to actively seek solutions that make accommodations feasible, not to prematurely dismiss them based on a single, potentially inflated cost. A further incorrect approach is to allocate a fixed percentage of the employee's salary towards accommodation costs, regardless of the actual expenses. This is professionally unacceptable because it creates an arbitrary financial cap that is not tied to the specific needs of the accommodation or the employer's ability to afford it. Alabama disability rights law focuses on the actual cost and feasibility of the accommodation, not on a predetermined, unrelated financial metric. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly identifying the employee's needs and the potential accommodations. 2. Researching and understanding the specific legal obligations under Alabama disability rights law. 3. Conducting a thorough, documented cost analysis for each viable accommodation, including exploring all potential cost reductions and funding sources. 4. Assessing the net cost against the definition of undue hardship as interpreted under Alabama law. 5. Engaging in an interactive process with the employee to discuss the proposed accommodations and their costs. Question 11. Strategic planning requires a manufacturing company in Alabama to review its hiring practices. A long-term employee who has recently disclosed a progressive neurological condition that affects their fine motor skills requests a modification to their workstation to include specialized tools and a reduced production quota for tasks requiring precise hand movements. The employee has consistently met performance expectations prior to their diagnosis. What is the most appropriate course of action for the company to take to ensure compliance with Alabama disability rights law? Option A. Grant the employee's request for specialized tools and a reduced production quota without a detailed assessment, assuming it is a reasonable accommodation. Option B. Immediately deny the request for a reduced production quota, citing the need to maintain consistent productivity levels across all employees without further discussion. Option C. Inform the employee that their previous performance record is sufficient grounds to assume they can still perform all essential functions without any modifications, and therefore no accommodation is necessary. Option D. Initiate an interactive process with the employee to discuss their specific limitations and explore potential reasonable accommodations, such as providing specialized tools and assessing the feasibility of adjusting production quotas for certain tasks, while considering if these adjustments would impose an undue hardship on the company. The correct answer is D. Initiate an interactive process with the employee to discuss their specific limitations and explore potential reasonable accommodations, such as providing specialized tools and assessing the feasibility of adjusting production quotas for certain tasks, while considering if these adjustments would impose an undue hardship on the company. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing an employer's legitimate business needs with an employee's rights under Alabama disability law. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing whether an employee's request for accommodation is reasonable and whether denying it would constitute unlawful discrimination. Misinterpreting the definition of a qualified individual can lead to significant legal and ethical repercussions for the employer. The best professional approach involves a thorough, individualized assessment of the employee's limitations and the feasibility of the requested accommodation. This means engaging in an interactive process with the employee to understand their specific needs and exploring potential modifications to job duties, work environment, or policies that would enable them to perform the essential functions of their position. This approach aligns with the principles of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as adopted and interpreted under Alabama law, which mandates reasonable accommodations unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the employer. The employer must demonstrate a good faith effort to accommodate. An approach that immediately denies the accommodation based on a generalized concern about productivity without exploring alternatives is professionally unacceptable. This failure to engage in the interactive process and to consider reasonable accommodations directly contravenes the spirit and letter of Alabama disability rights law, which presumes that individuals with disabilities are capable of performing essential job functions with appropriate support. Such a denial risks being viewed as discriminatory. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to grant the accommodation without a proper assessment of its reasonableness or its impact on essential job functions. While accommodation is required, it must be reasonable and not create an undue hardship. Uncritically granting any requested accommodation, regardless of its feasibility or impact, can lead to operational inefficiencies and may not be legally defensible if challenged. This approach bypasses the necessary due diligence required by law. Finally, an approach that relies solely on the employee's previous performance history without considering how their disability might affect their ability to perform essential functions in the current role is flawed. While past performance is a factor, it does not negate the employer's obligation to assess current needs and provide reasonable accommodations. This overlooks the dynamic nature of disability and the employer's affirmative duty to explore accommodations. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the legal definition of a qualified individual under Alabama law, which includes individuals with disabilities who can perform the essential functions of the job, with or without reasonable accommodation. The decision-making process should then involve 1. Initiating an interactive dialogue with the employee. 2. Identifying the essential functions of the job. 3. Exploring potential reasonable accommodations. 4. Assessing whether any proposed accommodation would cause an undue hardship. And 5. Documenting the entire process and the rationale for any decision. Question 12. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a specific assistive technology for an employee with a disability in Alabama would incur significant upfront costs and require minor adjustments to workflow for other team members. The employee has requested this technology to perform essential job functions. What is the most appropriate course of action for the employer? Option A. Implement a different, less expensive assistive tool that the employer believes might help, without consulting the employee about its suitability. Option B. Advise the employee that their request cannot be accommodated due to the financial and operational impact on the company. Option C. Initiate a formal interactive process with the employee to discuss their needs, explore potential reasonable accommodations including the requested technology, and assess feasibility and potential alternatives. Documenting all steps. Option D. Decline the request for the assistive technology, citing the upfront costs and workflow adjustments as undue hardship without further investigation. The correct answer is C. Initiate a formal interactive process with the employee to discuss their needs, explore potential reasonable accommodations including the requested technology, and assess feasibility and potential alternatives, documenting all steps. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the immediate financial interests of the employer against the legal rights and dignity of an employee with a disability. Navigating this requires a careful balance of legal compliance, ethical considerations, and effective communication. The pressure to maintain operational efficiency can create a temptation to take shortcuts that violate disability rights laws. The correct approach involves a proactive and collaborative engagement with the employee to identify reasonable accommodations. This means engaging in an interactive process, as mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which is applicable in Alabama. This process requires the employer to discuss the employee's limitations and potential accommodations, document these discussions, and explore effective solutions that enable the employee to perform the essential functions of their job without undue hardship to the employer. This approach is legally sound because it directly addresses the employer's obligation to provide reasonable accommodations and fosters an inclusive work environment. Ethically, it demonstrates respect for the employee's rights and well-being. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the employee's request for accommodation based on a superficial assessment of cost or inconvenience without a thorough exploration of options. This fails to meet the legal standard of engaging in an interactive process and could be seen as discriminatory. Another incorrect approach is to implement a unilateral accommodation that does not adequately address the employee's needs or was not discussed with the employee. This bypasses the essential collaborative element of the interactive process and may not be effective, potentially leading to further issues and legal challenges. Finally, ignoring the request or delaying a response indefinitely is a clear violation of the employer's legal obligations and demonstrates a lack of respect for the employee's rights. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the legal framework governing disability rights in Alabama, particularly the ADA. They should then initiate a structured, documented interactive process with the employee, focusing on understanding the specific limitations and exploring a range of potential accommodations. This process should be guided by principles of fairness, respect, and a commitment to finding a workable solution that allows the employee to succeed while considering the employer's operational needs and the concept of undue hardship. Question 13. The assessment process reveals that a long-term employee in an Alabama-based manufacturing company who has recently been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition has requested a modified work schedule and the use of specialized ergonomic equipment to continue performing their essential job functions. The employee has provided a doctor's note outlining the limitations, but has not specified the exact nature of the equipment or the precise schedule adjustments needed, stating they are open to suggestions. The supervisor is concerned about potential disruptions to team workflow and the cost of specialized equipment. What is the most appropriate course of action for the supervisor to take? Option A. Implement a temporary, minimal accommodation based on the supervisor's assumptions about the employee's needs, without further discussion, and monitor performance closely. Option B. Deny the request outright, citing concerns about workflow disruption and potential costs, and suggest the employee seek employment elsewhere if they can no longer perform their duties. Option C. Inform other team members about the employee's medical condition and the requested accommodations to solicit their input on how to manage the situation. Option D. Initiate a formal interactive process with the employee to discuss their specific needs, explore potential reasonable accommodations, and collaboratively determine solutions that are effective for the employee and do not impose an undue hardship on the company. The correct answer is D. Initiate a formal interactive process with the employee to discuss their specific needs, explore potential reasonable accommodations, and collaboratively determine solutions that are effective for the employee and do not impose an undue hardship on the company. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing an employer's legitimate business needs with an employee's rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA), as interpreted and enforced within Alabama. The core conflict lies in determining whether the requested accommodation is reasonable and does not impose an undue hardship on the employer, while also ensuring the employee's privacy and dignity are respected. Careful judgment is required to avoid discrimination and legal liability. The best professional approach involves engaging in a good-faith interactive process with the employee to explore all potential reasonable accommodations. This means actively listening to the employee's needs, discussing the limitations imposed by their condition, and collaboratively identifying solutions that enable them to perform the essential functions of their job without causing undue hardship to the employer. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the ADA mandate for an interactive process to identify reasonable accommodations. Alabama employers are bound by federal ADA regulations, which emphasize this collaborative dialogue as the primary mechanism for resolving accommodation requests. This process ensures that the employer gathers sufficient information to make an informed decision and demonstrates a commitment to compliance and employee support. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the request based on a perceived inconvenience or a superficial assessment of the employee's capabilities without further investigation. This fails to engage in the required interactive process and could be construed as discriminatory, violating the ADA prohibition against discrimination based on disability. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a solution that does not adequately address the employee's stated needs or that creates new barriers to their job performance. This demonstrates a lack of genuine effort to provide an effective accommodation and could lead to continued performance issues and potential legal challenges. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to disclose the employee's medical information to other staff members without their explicit consent. This violates the employee's right to privacy and could have serious ethical and legal repercussions, even if the intention was to explain the accommodation. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the legal framework, ADA in this case, then initiating a structured, documented interactive process. This involves open communication, a willingness to explore various options, and a focus on finding a mutually agreeable solution that allows the employee to perform their job duties effectively while respecting the employer's operational needs. Question 14. Which approach would be most effective for an employer in Alabama to take when an employee requests an accommodation for a disability that may impact their ability to perform essential job functions, ensuring compliance with Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act? Option A. Initiate a collaborative discussion with the employee to understand their limitations and explore potential reasonable accommodations, documenting all steps of the interactive process. Option B. Focus exclusively on the potential cost of accommodations, rejecting any that appear expensive without exploring their effectiveness or alternative solutions. Option C. Offer a superficial accommodation that does not fully address the employee's stated limitations, assuming it is sufficient. Option D. Immediately determine that no reasonable accommodation is possible based on initial assumptions about the job's demands and the employee's condition. The correct answer is A. Initiate a collaborative discussion with the employee to understand their limitations and explore potential reasonable accommodations, documenting all steps of the interactive process. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing an employer's operational needs with an employee's rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA), as interpreted and enforced within Alabama. The employer must assess the feasibility and effectiveness of accommodations without discriminating against the employee based on their disability. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Title I of the ADA, which prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in employment. The best approach involves a collaborative and interactive process between the employer and the employee to identify effective reasonable accommodations. This process begins with the employer engaging in a good faith discussion with the employee to understand the nature of the disability and the specific limitations it imposes on the employee's ability to perform essential job functions. The employer should then explore potential accommodations, considering both the employee's suggestions and the employer's operational realities. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the ADA mandate for an interactive process to determine reasonable accommodations. Alabama employers are bound by federal ADA regulations, which emphasize this dialogue as a crucial step in preventing discrimination and ensuring that qualified individuals with disabilities can perform their jobs. This process allows for flexibility and creativity in finding solutions that work for both parties, thereby fulfilling the employer's legal obligations. An approach that involves unilaterally deciding that no accommodation is possible without consulting the employee is professionally unacceptable. This failure to engage in the interactive process is a direct violation of the ADA. Presumes the employer knows best what accommodations are feasible or effective, without considering the employee's unique perspective and needs. This can lead to discriminatory outcomes and legal challenges. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to offer an accommodation that does not effectively address the employee's limitations or that creates an undue hardship for the employee, without exploring less burdensome alternatives. The ADA requires accommodations to be effective, meaning they must enable the employee to perform the essential functions of the job. Simply offering a superficial or ineffective solution does not meet this standard and can be seen as a form of discrimination. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the cost of potential accommodations without considering their effectiveness or exploring less expensive alternatives is also flawed. While undue hardship is a defense, it is a high bar to meet and requires a thorough analysis of the employer's resources and the nature of the accommodation. Ignoring the effectiveness of the accommodation in favor of a cost-based decision is not compliant with the ADA. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the legal framework, specifically Title I of the ADA. They should then initiate a structured, yet flexible, interactive process with the employee. This involves active listening, open communication, and a willingness to explore various accommodation options. Documentation of each step of this process is crucial for demonstrating good faith and compliance. If uncertainty remains regarding the feasibility or effectiveness of accommodations, seeking legal counsel specializing in employment law in Alabama is a prudent step. Question 15. Investigation of a request for services by an individual with a disability in Alabama requires a careful understanding of the legal landscape. Which of the following approaches best reflects the foundational legislative milestones that govern disability rights and would lead to a legally compliant and ethically sound assessment? Option A. Conduct a preliminary assessment based on the perceived administrative burden of the request, deferring a full legal review until significant resources are potentially committed. Option B. Rely exclusively on any internal agency policies and procedures that have been developed over time, assuming they adequately address the needs of individuals with disabilities within the state. Option C. Assess the individual's needs and potential accommodations by referencing the protections and requirements established by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, as these federal laws are directly applicable in Alabama. Option D. Prioritize any specific, recently enacted Alabama state statutes that may offer unique provisions, without first establishing the baseline protections provided by federal disability rights legislation. Correct answer is C. Assess the individual's needs and potential accommodations by referencing the protections and requirements established by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, as these federal laws are directly applicable in Alabama. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs of an individual seeking services with the legal obligations and historical context of disability rights legislation in Alabama. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the relevant legal framework and applying its principles to a specific situation, ensuring compliance while upholding the individual's rights. Misinterpreting or misapplying these laws can lead to discriminatory practices and legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves recognizing that the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, ADA, are foundational federal laws that significantly impact disability rights in Alabama. These laws establish broad protections against discrimination and mandate reasonable accommodations. Therefore, the most appropriate initial step is to assess the individual's needs in light of these federal mandates, which are directly applicable in Alabama. This approach ensures that the assessment is grounded in established legal principles designed to prevent discrimination and promote equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on any informal, uncodified agency policies that may not fully align with federal disability rights legislation. Such policies, if they contradict or fall short of the protections offered by the Rehabilitation Act or the ADA, would represent a failure to comply with federal law, potentially leading to discriminatory outcomes. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the individual's request based on a narrow interpretation of state-specific regulations, without first considering the broader protections afforded by federal law. While state laws can supplement federal protections, they cannot diminish them. Failing to consider the comprehensive scope of the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act would be a significant legal and ethical oversight. Finally, an approach that prioritizes administrative convenience over the legal rights of the individual, such as delaying assessment or imposing undue burdens, would violate the spirit and letter of disability rights legislation. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama dealing with disability rights must adopt a proactive and informed approach. This involves staying current with both federal and state disability rights laws. When faced with a request for services or accommodations, the decision-making process should begin with a thorough understanding of the applicable legal landscape, prioritizing federal mandates like the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act due to their broad applicability and established precedent. Any assessment or decision must be demonstrably aligned with these legal frameworks, ensuring that the individual's rights are protected and that the organization is acting in full compliance. Question 16. Assessment of the Alabama Board of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors response to a complaint alleging professional misconduct by a licensed engineer, considering the engineer's due process rights under Alabama law. Option A. The board should dismiss the complaint without further inquiry if the complainant appears credible and the allegation seems serious. Option B. The board should initiate a formal investigation, provide the engineer with written notice of the specific charges, and offer a hearing where the engineer can present evidence and arguments before any disciplinary action is considered. Option C. The board should immediately suspend the engineer's license upon receiving the complaint to protect the public, pending a full investigation. Option D. The board should issue a reprimand based solely on the complainant's written statement, assuming the allegations are true. The correct answer is B. the board should initiate a formal investigation, provide the engineer with written notice of the specific charges, and offer a hearing where the engineer can present evidence and arguments before any disciplinary action is considered. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a licensed professional facing potential disciplinary action. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for accountability and public protection with the individual's fundamental right to due process. Missteps in handling such situations can lead to legal challenges, reputational damage, and a failure to uphold the integrity of the profession. The Alabama Board of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors must navigate these complexities with precision and adherence to established legal standards. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves initiating a formal investigation based on credible allegations, providing the licensee with clear written notice of the charges, and affording them a meaningful opportunity to respond and present evidence before any disciplinary action is taken. This approach aligns directly with the due process requirements mandated by Alabama law, specifically the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act (APA) and the Alabama Board of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors' own rules and regulations. Due process ensures fairness by requiring notice and an opportunity to be heard, thereby protecting the licensee from arbitrary or unfounded disciplinary actions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately suspending the licensee's professional license upon receiving a complaint, without conducting a thorough investigation or providing the licensee with an opportunity to respond. This violates due process by depriving the individual of their livelihood and professional standing without a fair hearing. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the complaint summarily based on the complainant's perceived credibility, without affording the licensee any notice or chance to address the allegations. This fails to meet the investigative obligations and denies the licensee their right to defend themselves. Finally, imposing a disciplinary action based on hearsay evidence alone, without corroboration or allowing the licensee to challenge the evidence, is also professionally unacceptable and legally unsound under Alabama's administrative law principles. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing disciplinary matters should always prioritize adherence to established legal procedures and ethical guidelines. This involves a systematic approach. First, verifying the credibility and substance of any complaint. Second, conducting a thorough and impartial investigation. Third, providing the accused party with clear, specific notice of the allegations. Fourth, offering a genuine opportunity for the accused to present their case, including evidence and witnesses. And fifth, making disciplinary decisions based on substantial evidence and in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. This structured process ensures fairness, transparency, and accountability. Question 17. Benchmark analysis indicates that a new video conferencing platform, designed for widespread use across Alabama, is being developed. The developers are aware that Title Roman IV of the Americans with Disabilities Act mandates telecommunications relay services, TRS, for individuals with hearing and speech disabilities. Given the platform's advanced video capabilities, what is the most prudent and legally compliant approach to ensure accessibility for all Alabamians? Option A. Implement a video-based relay service that mirrors existing public access television captioning without seeking specific guidance on the platform's unique features. Option B. Proceed with the platform's launch, assuming that general internet accessibility guidelines are adequate and that specific Title Roman IV compliance will be addressed if issues arise post-launch. Option C. Proactively consult with the Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services or a similar state agency to understand specific requirements for video conferencing platforms under Title Roman IV and Alabama disability rights law, and integrate any recommended accessibility features into the platform's design and functionality. Option D. Assume that existing, traditional voice-only TRS standards are sufficient for the platform, and implement a basic audio relay option. The correct answer is C. Proactively consult with the Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services or a similar state agency to understand specific requirements for video conferencing platforms under Title Roman IV and Alabama disability rights law, and integrate any recommended accessibility features into the platform's design and functionality. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the provision of essential telecommunications services with the specific accessibility needs mandated by Alabama law for individuals with hearing and speech disabilities. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying Title Roman IV of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as adopted and potentially supplemented by Alabama's Specific Disability Rights Framework, to a novel technological service. A careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without unduly burdening the service provider or compromising the quality of service for all users. The best professional approach involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services or a designated state agency to seek clarification on the applicability of Title Roman IV Telecommunications Relay Services, TRS, requirements to the proposed video conferencing platform. This approach is correct because it demonstrates a commitment to understanding and adhering to state and federal mandates before launching a service that may impact individuals with disabilities. Specifically, Title Roman IV of the ADA mandates that telecommunications carriers provide telecommunications relay services, TRS, to ensure that individuals with hearing or speech disabilities can communicate with others through telephone voice transmission. While the ADA provides the overarching framework, Alabama's specific disability rights laws and administrative interpretations will dictate the precise obligations for new telecommunications services. Seeking official guidance ensures that the platform's design and implementation will meet or exceed the minimum accessibility standards, thereby avoiding potential legal challenges and ensuring equitable access for all Alabamians. This proactive engagement aligns with the ethical imperative to serve all members of the public and the legal requirement to comply with accessibility laws. An incorrect approach would be to assume that existing traditional TRS models are sufficient without considering the unique features of a video conferencing platform. This is professionally unacceptable because video conferencing offers a richer communication modality than traditional voice-only relay services, and simply applying old standards may not adequately address the communication needs of individuals who rely on visual cues or specialized input methods. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a basic audio-only relay service without exploring video-based accessibility features. This fails to leverage the capabilities of the platform to provide a more integrated and effective communication experience, potentially falling short of the spirit and intent of Title Roman IV, which aims for functional equivalence in communication. Finally, ignoring the potential need for specific accessibility features, such as captioning integration or compatibility with assistive listening devices, and proceeding with the launch without any consideration for disability access, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a disregard for the rights of individuals with disabilities and a failure to comply with federal and state mandates. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding regulatory obligations, especially concerning protected classes. This involves conducting thorough research into applicable federal and state laws, consulting with legal counsel specializing in disability law, and, when faced with ambiguity or novel technologies, proactively seeking guidance from relevant government agencies. A commitment to inclusive design and equitable access should be a guiding principle throughout the development and deployment process. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows that a county public library in Alabama is reviewing a request from a patron with a visual impairment who requires assistance navigating the library's online catalog and accessing digital resources. The library staff is considering various methods to address this request. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the requirements of Title Roman II of the Americans with Disabilities Act for Public Services in Alabama? Option A. Deny the request outright, citing the library's limited budget for specialized assistive technology, without further investigation into the patron's specific needs or alternative, less costly solutions. Option B. Offer to provide printed copies of search results from the online catalog, assuming this will adequately substitute for direct digital access, without confirming with the patron if this alternative is effective for their needs. Option C. Implement a general policy of providing basic screen reader software on all public computers, without consulting the patron to determine if this meets their unique requirements for navigating the online catalog and digital resources. Option D. Engage in a direct conversation with the patron to understand their specific needs and explore potential assistive technologies or alternative methods for accessing the online catalog and digital resources, while also assessing the feasibility and cost of implementing these solutions for the library. The correct answer is D. Engage in a direct conversation with the patron to understand their specific needs and explore potential assistive technologies or alternative methods for accessing the online catalog and digital resources, while also assessing the feasibility and cost of implementing these solutions for the library. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that ensuring equitable access to public services for individuals with disabilities in Alabama is a complex undertaking, requiring a nuanced understanding of Title Roman II of the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA), as it applies to state and local government entities. The scenario presents a challenge, because it involves balancing the operational needs of a public entity with the legal and ethical obligations to provide reasonable accommodations. The professional challenge lies in identifying the most effective and legally compliant method to address a specific accommodation request without unduly burdening the public entity or compromising the individual's rights. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between effective accommodations and those that would fundamentally alter the nature of the service or impose an undue burden. The best approach involves a collaborative and individualized assessment process. This entails engaging directly with the individual requesting the accommodation to understand their specific needs and limitations. It also requires a thorough review of the public service in question to identify potential modifications or alternative methods that would provide equivalent access. The goal is to find a solution that is both effective for the individual and feasible for the public entity, adhering to the principles of reasonable accommodation and non-discrimination, mandated by Title Roman II of the ADA. This proactive and individualized approach ensures compliance and fosters an inclusive environment. An approach that focuses solely on the cost of the accommodation without considering its necessity or alternative solutions is flawed. While undue financial burden is a valid defense, it cannot be the sole determinant without first exploring less costly or equally effective alternatives. This fails to meet the ADA requirement to provide reasonable accommodations. Another incorrect approach is to deny the accommodation based on a generalized policy that does not account for individual circumstances. Title Roman II requires a case-by-case evaluation to determine if an accommodation is reasonable and necessary. A blanket denial, without considering the specific needs of the individual and the nature of the service, is discriminatory and violates the spirit and letter of the law. Finally, an approach that assumes the individual's needs can be met by a less effective alternative without consulting them is also unacceptable. The effectiveness of an accommodation must be judged from the perspective of the individual with the disability. Imposing a solution that does not adequately address their needs, even if it seems reasonable to the public entity, fails to provide the required equal access. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes direct communication with the individual, a thorough assessment of the service and the requested accommodation, and a diligent exploration of all reasonable options before considering any potential undue burden. This process should be documented to demonstrate good faith efforts and adherence to legal requirements. Question 19. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a client in Alabama has experienced alleged discrimination based on a disability. The client is understandably distressed and eager for a swift resolution. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for a professional advising this client regarding their rights and options under Alabama disability rights law? Option A. Advise the client to directly engage in mediation with the alleged discriminator without first filing a formal administrative complaint. Option B. Recommend that the client abandon any pursuit of administrative remedies and focus solely on gathering evidence for a future court case. Option C. Provide a comprehensive explanation of the administrative complaint filing process with the relevant Alabama state agency and the voluntary mediation options available, detailing the purpose, steps, and potential outcomes of each. Option D. Immediately initiate a lawsuit in state court, bypassing any administrative review or mediation processes. The correct answer is C. Provide a comprehensive explanation of the administrative complaint filing process with the relevant Alabama state agency and the voluntary mediation options available, detailing the purpose, steps, and potential outcomes of each. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the client's immediate desire for resolution with the procedural requirements and potential benefits of the administrative complaint and mediation processes established by Alabama law. Misunderstanding or misapplying these processes can lead to delays, prejudice the client's case, or result in an unfavorable outcome. Careful judgment is required to navigate the client's emotional state and ensure adherence to legal frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly explaining the administrative complaint and mediation processes available under Alabama disability rights law to the client. This includes outlining the steps involved in filing a complaint with the relevant state agency, the potential timelines, the purpose and nature of mediation as a voluntary dispute resolution mechanism, and the client's rights and responsibilities at each stage. This approach is correct because it empowers the client with knowledge, sets realistic expectations, and ensures that any subsequent actions are informed and strategic, aligning with the procedural safeguards and dispute resolution mechanisms provided by Alabama law. It prioritizes client autonomy and informed consent, which are ethical imperatives. Incorrect approaches analysis. Pursuing immediate legal action without first exploring or explaining the administrative complaint and mediation processes is procedurally premature and potentially detrimental. This approach fails to leverage the established administrative remedies designed to resolve disability discrimination issues efficiently and cost-effectively within Alabama. Bypasses a crucial step that might lead to a swifter resolution or provide valuable information for subsequent litigation. Focusing solely on mediation without first understanding the client's specific allegations and ensuring they are properly documented in an administrative complaint overlooks the foundational requirement for initiating formal dispute resolution. While mediation is a valuable tool, it typically follows or is facilitated by the filing of a complaint, and proceeding without this initial step may render the mediation ineffective or unsupported by the necessary procedural framework under Alabama law. Advising the client to abandon the administrative complaint process entirely in favor of immediate court action, without a thorough evaluation of the merits and the exhaustion of administrative remedies where applicable, is a significant ethical and legal misstep. Alabama law often requires or strongly encourages the use of administrative remedies before resorting to judicial intervention, and prematurely filing a lawsuit could lead to dismissal or procedural hurdles, ultimately harming the client's case. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centered approach that prioritizes education and procedural adherence. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the client's concerns and objectives. 2. Thoroughly explaining the relevant legal framework, including administrative complaint and mediation processes under Alabama disability rights law. 3. Collaboratively developing a strategy that aligns with the client's goals and the procedural requirements. 4. Ensuring the client provides informed consent for all proposed actions. Question 20. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a public school district in Alabama must provide a student with a hearing impairment with a qualified sign language interpreter for all core academic classes and extracurricular activities. The student attends 5 core academic classes per week, each lasting 50 minutes, and participates in 1 extracurricular activity for 2 hours per week. The school district has secured a rate of $65 per hour for qualified interpreters, and the academic year consists of 36 weeks. What is the total estimated annual cost for providing this specific auxiliary aid? Option A, $10,400. Option B, $13,000. Option C, $18,200. Option D, $15,600. The correct answer is D, $15,600. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in accurately calculating the financial impact of a Section 504 violation, specifically concerning the provision of auxiliary aids and services for a student with a disability in Alabama. The challenge lies in translating the qualitative need for services into a quantifiable cost, ensuring compliance with federal mandates while managing educational resources. Precise calculation is crucial to avoid underfunding essential accommodations or overspending unnecessarily, both of which can lead to further legal or financial repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a detailed, itemized calculation of the direct costs associated with providing the necessary auxiliary aids and services. This approach directly addresses the mandate of Section 504 by ensuring that the financial burden of accommodation is accurately assessed and accounted for. Specifically, it requires identifying each required service, e.g., sign language interpreter, assistive technology, specialized materials, determining the hourly or unit cost for each, and then multiplying by the estimated duration or frequency of need. For example, if a sign language interpreter is needed for 10 hours per week at a rate of $50 per hour for a 36-week school year, the calculation would be /10 /text hours /week times $50 text hour times 36 text week year equals $18,000 text per year . This method ensures that all direct expenses are captured, providing a transparent and defensible budget for compliance. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to estimate the cost based on a general per-student allocation for special education services without itemizing the specific needs for auxiliary aids. This fails to acknowledge the unique and often variable costs associated with different types of disabilities and required accommodations, potentially leading to an underestimation of the actual financial obligation under Section 504. Another incorrect approach is to solely consider the cost of assistive technology hardware and ignore the associated expenses of software, maintenance, training for staff and the student, and ongoing technical support. Section 504 requires effective communication and access, which often extends beyond the initial purchase price of equipment. A further incorrect approach is to calculate the cost based on the average cost of similar services provided to other students without a disability. This fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of Section 504, which is to provide students with disabilities with equal access and opportunity, often requiring specialized and therefore potentially more costly resources. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a systematic and detailed approach to financial assessment for Section 504 compliance. This involves 1. Thoroughly identifying all required auxiliary aids and services based on an individualized assessment of the student's needs. 2. Researching and obtaining accurate cost data for each identified service or aid, including direct costs, indirect costs like training, and ongoing maintenance. 3. Performing precise calculations for each item and aggregating them to determine the total financial impact. 4. Documenting all assumptions, cost sources, and calculations to ensure transparency and accountability. This rigorous process ensures that the institution meets its legal obligations under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in Alabama while making informed budgetary decisions.